The prairie had a way of making a man feel small. Wide skies stretched forever. The wind moved like a whisper through endless fields of golden grass. And the mountains in the distance stood like old sentinels, watching everything below. Out there, silence wasn't empty, it was heavy. It pressed on the chest of anyone who worked the land, filling the nights with a lonesome weight that no hard day of labor could shake. That silence was what the rancher knew best. He had grown used to it, or at least he told himself so. Yet in truth, the silence had been eating at him for years, even as he rose before dawn, worked the cattle, fixed the fences, and rode the fields until the sun slid behind the ridges. A man could grow mighty tired of cooking beans over a fire, of eating cold bread alone, and of hearing nothing but the creak of the barn in the wind when the day ended. That's why he'd decided he needed a cook. Nothing fancy, just someone steady enough to keep a kitchen warm, fill a table, and soften the edge of that gnawing emptiness. He hadn't been looking for much more than that. Just food, some order in the house, and maybe a bit of company to nod to over supper before the lamps went out. He thought that would be enough. But he hadn't counted on the sound of her voice drifting through the dark. She had come to his ranch at the start of summer, stepping down from the wagon with little more than a worn bag and a look of quiet resolve. The mountains framed her figure as she crossed the yard, her boots sinking into the dust with the sure step of someone who had traveled far. She was no stranger to hard work. He could see it in the way her shoulders squared and her eyes took stock of the barn, the corral, and the lonely house with its weathered porch. She didn't flinch. That mattered to him more than he let on. Days passed, and she moved through the kitchen like she belonged there. Fresh bread replaced dry biscuits, stew simmered slow on the stove, and coffee in the morning no longer tasted bitter. The rancher had thought that alone might be enough to fill the empty cracks of his life. But then came the first night he heard her singing. It was late. The moon stretched pale across the prairie, and he had settled in by the dying fire. The house was quiet except for the groan of the old wood settling into the cool. Then, soft at first, a melody rose from the back room where she stayed. It wasn't a performance. It was something unguarded, private, as if she thought the night itself was her only audience. The sound wove through the walls, carrying into the rancher's chest like a memory he didn't know he'd buried. A woman's song, tender and aching, threading through the lonely silence of the plains. He lay awake long after the last note faded. The next evening, it came again, and again after that. He found himself waiting for it, listening for the moment when her voice would rise against the quiet. Each song seemed to carry pieces of her soul, the kind of pieces she never offered in words during the day. Around the table, she spoke little beyond the needs of the ranch, but at night, she gave away something else entirely, something that stirred him in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't just her voice, it was the way it reached into the hollow places inside him, filling them with warmth he hadn't felt in years. The rancher had wanted a cook, plain and simple, but every night her singing reminded him that he wanted more, much more. He wanted a woman's presence not only in the kitchen, but by the fire, across the table, and in the stillness of dawn. He wanted someone who could soften the ache of solitude, someone who could share in the small joys and the hard burdens. The trouble was, he didn't know how to say it. He'd lived too long in silence, too long with nothing but cattle and chores for company. Words didn't come easy, not the kind that mattered. Instead, he found himself watching her in ways he hadn't meant, to when she brushed a loose strand of hair from her face while kneading dough, when the light from the window caught her features just so, when she hummed absent-mindedly while setting bread on the table. Little things, simple things, but they worked at him like water wearing down stone. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon and the shadows stretched long over the pasture, he caught her standing on the porch, her voice rising in a song he had never heard before. The notes drifted out over the field, mixing with the lowing of cattle and the cry of a distant hawk. He stood frozen, halfway to the barn, listening. Something inside him burned, fierce and undeniable. He knew then that the cook he had hired wasn't just easing his hunger for food. She was stirring a hunger of another kind, one he could no longer ignore. But how was he to bridge the silence? He had built his life on sturdy fences, straight lines, and rules that kept everything in place. To admit what he felt would mean breaking down walls he had kept strong for years. And what if she didn't feel the same? What if her songs were nothing more than habit, a comfort she gave herself at the end of a long day? Could he risk making a fool of himself? That night, as the fire in the hearth dwindled to embers, he sat at the table with his hands wrapped tight around a chipped mug. The house was quiet, but he could hear her voice again, faint through the walls, steady and sweet. Each note tightened the knot in his chest until he could hardly breathe. He had wanted a cook, but now he wanted something deeper, something he didn't dare name aloud. And as her song drifted into the night, he realized with a jolt that the rancher who had been content with silence could no longer stand it. He needed her voice, her presence, her hand in his life. The question was whether he would find the courage to speak before the chance slipped away. The music faded, leaving only the steady creak of the old house in the dark. He rose from his chair, heart pounding, and stepped toward the hallway where her door stood closed. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the ranch, or the cattle, or the endless work waiting in the morning. He was thinking only of her. His hand hovered near the doorframe, trembling with hesitation. And then he heard the sound of footsteps, soft and unhurried, crossing the wooden floor toward him. The footsteps were light, steady, and for a moment he thought he had imagined them. But then the soft sound drew closer, and the rancher froze, as if the floor beneath him had turned to stone. He stood at the edge of the hallway, the glow from the fire behind him casting long shadows across the wooden boards. His breath felt too loud, his heart too wild, and in the stillness, he wondered if she could hear it hammering in his chest. The door creaked open, and there she was. She wore a simple nightdress, nothing fancy, just pale fabric that brushed her ankles and made her look almost ghost-like in the dim light. Her hair spilled loose around her shoulders, and her eyes, searching, met his. She did not seem surprised to find him standing there, as though she had known he would be waiting. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The house seemed to hold its breath. Behind them, the fire in the hearth let out a faint pop, sending sparks into the air. At last she tilted her head, her voice low but steady. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. He swallowed. The words caught somewhere in his throat. "No, not tonight." Her gaze lingered on him, curious, maybe even cautious. She didn't press him further. Instead, she turned slightly, looking toward the window where the moonlight spilled across the fields. The sound of coyotes carried faintly from the hills, mingling with the creak of the barn door in the wind. Her song was still clinging to the air, though it had ended minutes ago, like an echo that refused to fade. "You sing?" he said finally, his voice rough. "At night?" "Always at night." She looked back at him, her eyes steady. "It helps me rest. Out here, the silence feels heavy. A song makes it lighter." He nodded, his jaw tightening. He wanted to tell her what it did to him, that it set fire to the quiet inside him, that it made the emptiness ache less and burn more at the same time. But the words caught again, so he simply said, "It carries through the house." A faint smile touched her lips, the first he had seen from her since she arrived. "Does it bother you?" He shook his head quickly, maybe too quickly. "No, not at all." Something flickered in her expression. But before he could place it, she gave a small nod and stepped back toward her room. The door closed softly behind her, leaving him alone in the hallway, with the echo of her presence lingering like her song. He stood there longer than he should have, staring at the closed door, wondering what it would take to open it again, not with his hand, but with the truth that pressed so hard against his chest. The next morning dawned cold and bright. The prairie washed in gold as the sun climbed over the ridges. The rancher threw himself into work with a fierceness he hadn't felt in weeks. He saddled his horse, drove the cattle to water, mended a broken fence line. Anything to keep his hands busy and his mind away from the sound of her voice and the memory of her standing in the hallway. Yet even as he worked, he found himself glancing back at the house, as though expecting to see her on the porch. She was there by midday, hanging laundry on the line. Her sleeves rolled to her elbows and her hair pinned back against the breeze. She moved with quiet purpose, no wasted motion, no hesitation. She had settled into life on the ranch quickly, far quicker than he'd imagined anyone could. The kitchen had already taken on her touch, her careful order, her simple but rich meals. The rooms smelled of fresh bread, herbs, and the faint sweetness of soap she made from lion fat. It was as if she had always belonged, and yet he knew nothing of where she had come from, or what had brought her to a stranger's ranch on the edge of the wilderness. One evening, as they sat at the table over supper, he found the courage to ask, "You traveled far to get here?" She looked up. A piece of bread paused in her hand. Her eyes searched his as though weighing what to give away. "Far enough," she said softly. "Farther than most would choose to go?" He waited, but she didn't offer more. Her gaze dropped back to her plate, and the quiet stretched between them again. It wasn't the kind of silence he hated. Not anymore. It was heavy with questions, with all the things unsaid. The days slipped into weeks, and the rancher grew restless in ways he didn't fully understand. Her singing had become part of the night as surely as the stars above. He would lie awake waiting for it, each song pulling him deeper into a longing he couldn't shake. He wanted to know the meaning behind the tunes, wanted to ask who she had sung for before the lonely plains became her stage. But each time the chance came, he found himself silent, his words swallowed by the weight of everything that might change if he spoke them. The land itself seemed to sense the tension. A storm rolled in one evening, the sky dark with clouds that split open to release torrents of rain. The wind rattled the shutters and sent dust flying across the yard. He had been out with the herd, driving them to higher ground. And when he returned soaked through, she was waiting by the door with a lantern in hand. For a moment, her eyes lit on him with something more than worry, something deeper, almost tender, but she turned away quickly, busying herself with setting his coat to dry. That night, with the storm raging outside, her song was louder, stronger, as if she was pushing back against the thunder itself. He sat by the fire, boots off, shirt damp, listening with every nerve in his body strung tight. The wind howled, the rain pounded the roof. But her voice cut through it all, a steady flame in the darkness, and he realized something he had not dared admit before. He could live without bread, without warmth, even without sleep, but he could not live without her song. Without her, the thought shook him, because it meant the life he had built in silence was no longer enough. It meant he wanted more than he had ever allowed himself to want. And wanting meant risk. He began to notice small things about her that he hadn't before. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was deep in thought. The way her hands, roughened by work, were still graceful when she kneaded dough or stitched torn fabric. The way her eyes softened when she looked at the fields at dusk, as if the land spoke to her in some secret way. She carried her own kind of loneliness. He could see it now, though she never spoke of it. It lay behind her songs, hidden in the notes that trembled just enough to betray a heart that had known loss. He wanted to ask her about it. He wanted to know what she had left behind, what ghosts trailed her into the quiet of his home. But each time he tried, the words tangled in his throat, and instead he found himself watching, waiting, listening for what she might reveal without meaning to. The prairie stretched endless around them. But inside the house, the walls felt closer with each passing night. The air grew thick with what neither of them said. And though the days carried on with chores and the rhythm of ranch life, he knew something was building between them, something as steady as the mountains and as fierce as the storms. One night, as autumn winds rattled the windows and the first frost silvered the grass, he rose from the fire and stepped once more toward her door. The silence was broken only by her voice, soft and aching, carrying a song that felt older than either of them. He stopped just short of knocking, his hand hovering inches from the wood. On the other side, her voice trembled slightly, as if even she could no longer keep the weight of her own secrets contained. And he knew then that whatever had brought her here, whatever past she carried, it was bound to change everything. The rancher stood outside her door, hand hovering in the air, yet he could not bring himself to knock. Her song drifted through the wood like smoke curling into his chest, filling him with a heat that had nothing to do with the fire burning in the hearth. It was gentle and trembling all at once, the kind of song that spoke of wounds no one else had seen. He lowered his hands slowly, retreating down the hallway before she could know he had been there. It wasn't fear of her rejection alone that held him back. It was the sense that if he opened that door, everything about his quiet life would change. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for that storm. The next morning came gray and cold, the sky low and heavy over the plains. He found her outside by the corral, her hands tucked into her shawl as she watched the cattle stir in the frosted grass. She looked tired, the circles beneath her eyes faint but there, as though her own singing had carried her farther into the night than she meant. When she noticed him, she offered a small nod, but her gaze didn't linger. It struck him then how much she kept hidden. She worked hard, spoke little, and gave away only through her songs what her silence tried to bury. He returned to his chores, but unease followed him. The ranch was steady, the fences held, and the herd was strong. Yet something unsettled the air. It wasn't just the growing weight of his feelings. It was the way she looked toward the horizon sometimes, as if waiting for someone or something to appear. He wondered if she had left a family behind, or perhaps someone she couldn't speak of. He wanted to ask, but every time the question came to his lips, he stopped himself, fearing the answer would drive a wedge between them. Weeks passed. The first snow dusted the fields. Life on the ranch grew harder with the cold, but she faced it with quiet resolve. She rose before dawn, tended the kitchen, and braved the chill to help where she could. Yet he noticed how her songs changed with the season. They grew heavier, slower, tinged with a sorrow that made the nights ache deeper. Sometimes, listening in the dark, he felt as though she was singing to someone else entirely. Someone who lingered in her memory more than he did. That thought cut sharper than he cared to admit. One evening, after a long day of hauling feed through snow, he returned to find her by the fire with a letter in her hands. She was staring at it as though it carried a weight she couldn't bear. When she saw him, she quickly folded it and slipped it into her apron. Her face was calm, but he caught the shadow in her eyes. "You get mail?" he asked, his voice rough with curiosity. She shook her head faintly. "Just something I carried with me. Nothing new." He wanted to believe her, but the way her fingers clutched the fabric of her apron told him otherwise. He didn't press her, though the image of that letter stayed with him long after he had gone to bed. That night, her singing never came, and the silence felt heavier than ever. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, and the rancher's thoughts grew restless. He had hired her for simple reasons, yet nothing about her presence was simple anymore. He found himself wondering what secrets kept her voice tied to sorrow, what ghosts followed her across the wide prairie. Each song was a clue, but none gave a full answer. Meanwhile, the land brought its own troubles. Coyotes grew bold, slipping near the herd under cover of darkness. He lost 2 calves before he managed to track them down, riding out into the cold with rifle in hand. She begged him not to go alone, her worry breaking through her usual calm, but he waved it off. Out there beneath the moon, hunting the shadows. He thought of her waiting back at the house, a lantern burning in the window. That thought carried him through the night, yet when he returned, weary and chilled, her relief was mixed with anger. "You'll get yourself killed," she said sharply, her eyes shining with fire he had not seen before. He shrugged, though his heart stirred at her words. "It's part of ranch life. It doesn't have to be," she whispered. And for a moment he saw something in her face, fear, grief, longing all tangled together. But just as quickly, she turned away, retreating to her room without another word. That night, her song returned, but it was softer than before, as though even she no longer trusted the voice that betrayed too much. The conflict grew inside him. He wanted to demand the truth from her, to know what haunted her nights and why she clung to secrets even as her songs opened her heart. At the same time, he feared that if he pushed too hard, she might vanish from his life as quickly as she had come. He had been lonely for years, but the thought of returning to that emptiness now felt unbearable. Winter deepened, and with it came more signs that her past was not as distant as she tried to make it seem. One afternoon, while splitting wood near the barn, he saw her standing by the road, staring at a rider in the distance. The man paused at the rise, his figure dark against the snow, then turned and rode away without a word. When the rancher asked who it was, she shook her head and said she didn't know. But the way her hands trembled told him she was lying. Suspicion gnawed at him, yet so did the pull of her presence. He couldn't deny the warmth she brought into his life, even as mystery hung over her like a storm cloud. The ranch, once only a place of solitude and steady work, had become something else, entirely alive with questions, heavy with unspoken words. At night, her songs carried more urgency, as if she too felt the walls closing in. He listened from the shadows, torn between the desire to step forward and the fear of shattering what fragile peace they had built. Every note was a thread binding him tighter to her, yet every silence reminded him of the distance she kept. There were moments when he thought she might finally tell him the truth. Once, as they sat together by the fire, she looked at him with eyes full of something he couldn't name. Her lips parted, as though words hovered there, but then she turned away, humming a tune instead. Another time, he caught her in the barn, her hand resting against the flank of a horse as tears slipped silently down her cheeks. When he stepped closer, she straightened quickly, brushing them away, spoke only of the weather. The tension became its own kind of storm, building day by day. He knew her past would not remain buried forever, and he feared what would happen when it broke through. Would she leave? Would someone come for her? And if she stayed, would she ever let him close enough to share the truth? Through it all, the rancher kept working, kept living. But he was no longer the same man who once thought silence was enough. He had tasted something deeper, something that burned in him with every song she sang. And though he did not yet have the answers, he knew one thing for certain: her secrets and his longing were on a path that could not stay hidden much longer. One night, as the snow fell heavy outside and the wind wailed through the eaves, he sat in his chair by the fire, waiting. Her door was closed, the house dim, and for the first time in weeks, no song filled the air. He rose quietly, the silence pressing on him like a weight, and stepped into the hallway once more. But before he reached her door, he heard a sound he had not expected: the faint, muffled echo of another voice, low and steady, speaking through the walls. He stopped, heart pounding. She was not alone in her room. The rancher stood frozen in the hallway, every muscle in his body stiff with disbelief. The sound was faint, muffled by the wooden walls, but it was clear enough to set his heart racing. It was not her singing this time. It was a voice deep and steady, too low to make out words, but unmistakably a man's. He held his breath, straining to hear, trying to catch some hint of what was being said. The fire in the other room crackled softly, the wind rattled the shutters, but beneath it all, the murmur of that voice lingered. He stepped back slowly, his boots careful against the boards, and pressed himself against the wall. 1,000 questions struck him at once. Who was in her room? How had he gotten there without notice? And why would she hide it from him? The silence after the voice faded was worse than the sound itself. When at last he heard her move, her footsteps light, her tone hushed in reply, he felt the air tighten around him until it was hard to breathe. He did not hear the door open, nor anyone leave, yet when he found the courage to push closer, the room was dark and still. The voice had vanished, leaving only her soft humming as if nothing had happened. Sleep did not come for him that night. He lay awake, staring at the beams of the ceiling, listening for any sound that might explain what he had heard. Doubt gnawed at him like a coyote at a carcass. He had trusted her silence before, but now every moment seemed weighted with suspicion. When dawn finally broke, he rose early and busied himself with the cattle, his mind restless. Yet when he returned to the house, she was there at the stove, calm and steady, greeting him with the same soft nod as always. There was no sign of unease in her face, no crack in her composure. He almost convinced himself it had been a dream. Almost. But the unease would not leave. Days passed, and he caught her glancing at the road more often, her eyes narrowing when riders crossed the ridge. Once, he found her in the barn, clutching that folded letter again, her hand trembling until she noticed him and quickly hid it away. Another time, when he came in late from the fields. He thought he saw shadows moving near the window, but when he stepped inside, the house was empty, save for her at the table. Her voice too calm for the flicker of fear in her eyes. The ranch itself seemed to sense the tension. A wolf pack had moved in close to the herd, bolder than the coyotes, testing the fences at night. He set traps, reinforced the posts, and carried his rifle more often than before. Still, the feeling lingered that the real threat wasn't on four legs, but closer, tied to the mystery she carried with her. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, yet each time he looked into her tired eyes, the words died. Something in her face stopped him, a mixture of sorrow and resolve that told him she'd bore more than she was ready to share. One evening, the tension came to a head. He returned from the pasture to find fresh tracks in the snow near the barn boot prints. Not his own, leading from the fence line to the house. His blood ran cold as he followed them. They ended at the back door, fading as if whoever it was had slipped inside. He pushed open the door, rifle in hand, and there she was, standing by the fire with her shawl wrapped tight. Her face paled when she saw him, not at the rifle, but as though she had been caught unprepared. "Someone's been here," he said, his voice hard. She didn't answer at first, her hands clutching the fabric of her shawl. Finally she whispered, "You shouldn't worry about it." "That's not an answer," he shot back, stepping closer. "You know something. I've heard voices in this house. I've seen riders on the ridge, and now there are tracks at my door. You think I won't notice? But I do. Tell me the truth." Her lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes shone with something like fear, something like guilt, and for a moment he thought she might finally confess. But then she turned away, her shoulders stiff. "It's not your burden," she said softly. "Please, let it be." His chest tightened with frustration. "This is my land, my home. Anything that steps onto it is my burden. And if danger follows you here, I need to know." The silence between them crackled like dry wood catching flame. She stood still, refusing to meet his eyes, and he knew the wall between them was higher than ever. That night her song did not come, and the emptiness of it pressed heavier than any storm. The next morning, he found a stranger's horse tethered near the creek, half hidden among the brush. He trailed it cautiously, rifle ready, till he saw the man himself standing on the ridge, a long coat pulled tight against the wind. The stranger's face was shadowed beneath a wide hat, but when he spotted the rancher, he turned and vanished into the trees. The horse was gone when he returned to check again, as if the man had melted into the land itself. When he came back to the house, she was waiting by the door, her face pale. She didn't ask where he had been, but her eyes told him she already knew. "Who is he?" the rancher demanded, his voice sharp. Her hands clenched, but she said nothing. Instead, she moved past him into the house, her silence more damning than any answer. The days that followed were thick with tension. He worked the land harder, rising before dawn, riding the herd across the frozen fields, mending fences until his hands bled. But no matter how hard he pushed himself, he couldn't shake the thought of that stranger on the ridge, or the voice he had heard through her door. Each time she sang at night, he wondered if the songs were meant for him, or for someone else still holding her heart. Then came the night the wolves struck. He woke to the sound of panicked cattle bawling, the moon casting pale light across the corral. Grabbing his rifle, he stormed into the cold, firing into the dark to drive the beasts back. Their eyes gleamed in the night, wild and hungry. But it wasn't just the wolves that haunted him. When the last of them fled, he turned to find her standing by the barn, lantern in hand, her face stricken with fear. "You shouldn't be out here," he growled, though his anger was more at the unknown than at her. "I had to see," she whispered. "I had to be sure you were safe." The words struck him deep, but before he could answer, a gunshot rang out from the ridge. The bullet cracked the fence post inches from where he stood. He dropped low, rifle raised, scanning the darkness. The lantern in her hand trembled as she froze. The wolves were gone, but something far more dangerous lingered in the night. He pulled her toward the house, his heart hammering. Whoever had fired that shot was no stranger passing by. It was a warning or a claim, and he had no doubt it was tied to her secrets. Once inside, he barred the door and set his rifle on the table. She stood across from him, pale and silent, her hands still clutching the lantern. "It's him, isn't it?" he demanded, his voice low but fierce. "The one you've been hiding? The one who leaves tracks at my door and watches from the ridge, Tears welled in her eyes, but she turned away, unable to face him. The rancher's chest burned with fury and longing all at once. He wanted to shake the truth out of her, to demand answers, yet he also wanted to take her hand, to tell her that no matter what shadows followed, she wasn't alone anymore. But the words twisted inside him, caught between anger and yearning. Outside, the wind howled through the prairie, rattling the shutters like bones. The fire in the hearth snapped, throwing shadows across the walls. He stood there, breathing hard, staring at the woman who had turned his silence into song and his solitude into fire, and he knew with every fiber of his being that the storm was about to break. The fire burned low in the hearth, its glow barely holding back the shadows that pressed in around them. She stood by the window, her hand trembling as she set the lantern on the sill, and he could see her face clearly now, pale, drawn, and filled with something heavier than fear. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and dark, but it was the silence in the room that weighed most. The rancher set his rifle on the table, the metal cold in his calloused hands, and stared at her with a question that had waited too long. "Tell me the truth," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "If I'm to fight a man in the dark, I need to know why. Who is he, and why does he watch this place like a wolf, circling the herd?" She closed her eyes, and for the first time since she had come to the ranch, her shoulders sagged as though the strength she carried every day had finally given out. When she turned to face him, her eyes shimmered in the firelight, full of things she had kept locked away. "He is my husband," she whispered. The words struck like a blow. The rancher's chest tightened, his breath catching. He had feared it, suspected it, but hearing it plain made the truth cut sharper than any blade. She pressed on before he could speak. "Not the husband you might think. He is cruel, and he is relentless. I left him months ago, slipped away in the night when I couldn't take another day of his fists, his threats, his hunger for control. I thought I had gone far enough that he would never find me. But men like him don't give up what they think they own." Her voice cracked, and she gripped the edge of the window as though it were the only thing holding her steady. The rancher said nothing at first, his hands curling tight into fists. Images of the stranger on the ridge, the boot prints by the door, the shot that had nearly taken his life, all of it fell into place. "You should have told me," he said finally, his tone low but rough with hurt. "I wanted to," she answered, her eyes pleading. "Every night when I sang, I almost did, but I was afraid. Afraid if I spoke it aloud, I would bring him down on this house. Afraid you would send me away. And I didn't want to leave, not after what I found here." His chest ached, torn between the anger of her silence and the pull of her words. He had asked for a cook, nothing more, yet she had given him more than he ever expected, her quiet strength by day, her voice filling the emptiness by night. And now she was asking him to bear her truth, a truth that carried danger with it. Before he could answer, a sound split the night. Hoofbeats, steady and slow, approaching across the frozen ground. Both of them froze, listening. The rancher moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain just enough to see a figure riding toward the house. The man in the long coat, hat low over his brow, his horse's breath rising in clouds against the cold. "He's come," she whispered, her voice trembling. The rancher grabbed his rifle and checked the chamber, his jaw set. "Then we'll deal with him here." But she caught his arm, her grip fierce. "You don't understand. He doesn't stop. You might drive him off tonight, but he'll come again. He'll come until he tears this place apart." He looked at her then, really looked, and in her eyes he saw not just fear, but something else, trust. She was giving him the choice, whether to stand with her or send her away. The weight of it pressed heavy, but the decision came as naturally as drawing breath. "This is my land," he said firmly, "and no man rides onto it to take what isn't his. If he wants a fight, he'll have it, but he won't take you." Her lips parted, as though she wanted to protest, but no words came. Instead, tears welled, and she stepped back as the rancher moved toward the door. He pushed it open and stepped onto the porch, the cold night air biting at his skin. The rider stopped a short distance from the house, his shadow stretching long across the snow. "You've got something of mine," the man called, his voice carrying clear in the stillness. The rancher lifted his rifle, steady and sure. "She's not yours." Not anymore. A long silence followed, broken only by the wind whispering through the grass. The stranger shifted in his saddle, his eyes glinting under the brim of his hat. "Then you've chosen her over your own life." The rancher did not flinch. "So be it." For a moment it seemed the man might draw, his hand twitching near the holster at his hip. But then he sneered, yanked his reins, and turned his horse back toward the ridge. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice echoing in the night. "I'll be back, and when I come. There won't be enough bullets in that rifle to keep me away." The rancher watched him ride into the dark until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Only then did he lower the rifle, his breath steady, but his heart still pounding. He stepped back inside, closing the door firmly behind him. She was there, waiting, her face pale and her eyes searching his. "He'll come again," she whispered. "Let him," the rancher said, setting the rifle down. "If he thinks he can break this place, he doesn't know me. And he doesn't know you either." She sank into the chair by the fire, her hands trembling. For a long while, they sat in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on them. But there was something different in the quiet no-not emptiness. But resolve, days turned into weeks, and though the stranger did not return right away, the rancher kept watch. He rode the fence lines daily, kept his rifle close, and trained his eyes on the horizon. She worked beside him still, her songs returning at night. Though now they carried a new edge, less sorrow, more strength. As if she was no longer singing just to soothe herself, but to hold her ground in time. The fear that had once haunted her face began to fade. She laughed more, spoke more, and though the shadow of her past lingered, it no longer held her captive. The rancher saw the change, and it stirred something in him deeper than desire. He realized he didn't just want her songs or her cooking or her presence to fill the silence. He wanted her wholly and freely. Not as someone he hired, but as someone who belonged by his side. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the fields glowed gold, he stood with her on the porch. The air was crisp, the herd grazing peacefully in the distance. She hummed softly, the tune carrying on the breeze, and he felt the old weight of solitude lift from his chest. "You said once you were afraid I'd send you away," he said, his voice low. "But you should know, I'd rather fight off every storm, every wolf, every man who comes riding over that ridge than let you go." Her eyes met his, shining with a mixture of surprise and warmth. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the prairie wide and endless around them, until she reached out and took his hand. The rancher squeezed her fingers. The silence between them no longer heavy but full of promise. Whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them together. He had asked for a cook, but what he found was far more than he had ever expected. She had brought music into the silence, fire into the emptiness, and he knew now he would never let it go. The prairie still stretched endless. The mountains still stood like sentinels, and the wind still whispered through the grass. But the loneliness that once filled the ranch had been driven out, replaced by something stronger, something worth fighting for. And when her voice rose that night, soft and steady against the dark, it was no longer just a song. It was a promise. Top of form, bottom of form.